Hey everybody, Phil here. I call this video Don't Play Like a Solver, Think Like a Solver. And I call it that because, I believe that trying to emulate solver strategy through memorization of solver outputs is a recipe for failure. Whereas trying to understand why a solver does what it does so that you can logically think through any spot that you find yourself in the game tree, including spots that you'll never have studied because there are too many of them to possibly study, is the way to maximize your EV, which is the point of all of this. There are certain things that solvers are good for and certain things are not. Solvers are an excellent study tool. I truly don't believe that you can play high-level poker without studying them, at least somewhat. But solvers do a lot of things that are really hard to execute in practice. Solvers don't make mistakes. Humans do. So, yes, it might be correct to bet this certain hand because of the way that the solver's constructed its range, because of the way that the solver is in the other opponent's shoes is reacting to it, and because of the blocker effects. But in practice, we're not going to be able to execute all of that, and our opponent's not going to be able to react to all of that in a way that makes it make sense to bet that hand or makes it matter, I would say. Sometimes it's still going to be fine to bet that hand. Attempting to implement a strategy that complex leaves you open to huge exploits. Nobody is able to implement solver strategies in a way that doesn't leave them open to exploits. And I think actually the way to leave yourself the least exploitable is to make sure that you deeply understand the reasoning behind solver plays in every spots. And therefore, even if you make some mistakes, they're not going to leave massive gaps open. Whereas if I'm just trying to mimic a solver strategy, but I don't really understand why it's doing what it's doing, and I find myself in a turn spot where maybe I studied the ace 10-9 3 board, but this board is ace 10-9 king, and there are now enough different, obviously those are quite different boards, but let's say ace 10-9 3 with the flush hitting the turn, and this board is now ace 10-9 king with the flush hitting the turn, and I try to execute kind of the same strategy that I learned on the previous board. I'm going to be playing that board very incorrectly. And then the second problem with trying to implement solver strategy like that is that it's going to lead to wasting a lot of time and energy. I talked about in the previous video, but not only wasting time and energy at the table, but wasting time and energy away from the table. We only have so much mental bandwidth to use in game. We also have only so many hours to study. And if you spend your time studying ineffectively, studying things that are not going to move the needle for your EV, that's time you could have spent studying things that mattered more. So I want to start with the question, what is a mistake? It may sound like a silly question, and I actually have a silly example here to go along with it. On this king 10-3 flop, Vision wants you to always bet ace king 8-4 with the ace of hearts and the king 8 of spades. It wants you to always check ace king 8-4 with the ace of hearts, the king, and the 4 of spades. Now, I don't think anybody would argue that betting the first hand or checking the second hand is going to be a mistake based on this. This just shows you that the solver does things for reasons that are not going to matter in practice. These might have some specific blocker effects that in no way are going to impact the EV of either hand. So the EV of these two hands is going to be, in practice, identical, betting and checking. Yet the solver plays them each differently and not just mixes with them, but actually pure bets one and pure checks the other. And while this is an extreme example, there are a lot of them like this, it illustrates the point that I want to drive home, which is you need to get to a strategy that you can execute rather than trying to implement a solver strategy. All right, so this example, on the other hand, is one that I think some people will disagree with me on. So we find ourselves in a turn c-bet spot in a single raise pot. With Jack 6, we got the overcard ace, and in one example, we have the 5 of hearts, which is quite relevant because It blocks turn flush draws. It blocks rivered flushes when they come in. On the other hand, we don't. We have the 5 of clubs. Now, because of this, Vision bets with the 5 of hearts, just a little bit higher equity and some removal effect on hands that check raise us and hands that check call us, things like that, and checks with the 5 of clubs because it doesn't have those removal effects. In solver land, yeah, I agree that it makes sense that we bet with the 5 of hearts, check without. It's higher EV that way. In practice, I think that the EV difference is so minimal that I would not get hung up on it. And I do want to clarify that oftentimes you should use, I don't want to say shortcuts, but oftentimes you should use side cards, variables like this to control your frequencies, to randomize in a way so that you're betting some Jack 6, Ace Jack 6 and checking some Ace Jack 6. And so I don't mean to say that I don't ever go in these spots, okay, well, I have the 5 of hearts, so I'm going to bet, and without the 5 of hearts, I check. I do that sometimes. But it's not because I think the EV of betting and checking between these two hands is much different. It's because I'm controlling my frequencies. And I think that's a very key distinction because it's going to be important to determine, what constitutes a mistake that's going to cost us money and what doesn't. And I guess as a little preview into what I'm going to be talking about now and in the future, what I'm going to argue for and what I do personally is I simplify my strategies wherever I can, and I do so in ways that I don't believe cost me true EV. So hypothetically, I might decide that I'm going to check both of these hands, even away from the table. When I'm studying a solver, I see that it says bet one and check the other. I might decide I want to check both because I think the EV is basically the same between betting and checking, given that the 5 of hearts is not going to be a serious impact and not going to impact the way my opponent plays enough, etc. But I would do so in a way that still gives me board coverage. Having a mistake that leaves you open where you're not covering certain boards is a problem. Making mistakes where you're choosing the wrong combo to bet and the wrong combo to check, it just doesn't matter. If I played against an opponent who always bet with the 5 of clubs and always checked with the 5 of hearts here, I can't do anything about it. I'm not going to gain any real EV. So further to that point, here's an example where the board is King 10-3 rainbow. I have an example of two hands here that are Queen Jack with no board pair, no pair in our hand. One is Queen Jack 8-5 with backdoor hearts, Jack high. One is Queen Jack 6-4 with 6 high backdoor spades. Now you can see that Queen Jack 6-4 is mostly betting 95% of the time. Queen Jack 8-5 is essentially checking. It's pure checking. It's 99% of the time or so. Does it matter much if you bet one and check the other? No, not necessarily. Does it matter much if you bet both of these or check both of these? In isolation, no. In EV, in isolation, no. But what does matter is that you don't put all of your Queen Jack plus air into your betting range, and therefore, when you check back, never have Queen Jack plus air. That's what matters. And so it's not a question of which hand has higher EV doing this or that. It's just the differences are so minimal and people can't take advantage of it further. What they can take advantage of is mistakes in range construction. So on a board like this, we end up, if you're betting all of your Queen Jack plus air, you're betting all of your King Queen Jack, you're betting all of your Queen Jack 3, you're betting half of your Queen Jack 10. Well, now you're betting too much Queen Jack and your checking range doesn't have Queen Jack. And I can learn that and take advantage of that. So with those examples in mind, I want to present you with a riddle of sorts. And please take a moment to pause the video after I pose the question. If Bob runs all of his hands through a solver, and the solver comes back, runs them against, perfect optimal strategy. This solver is very advanced. It's got every bet size included possible, and it's definitely optimal. It says that Bob has lost 0.2 big blinds per 100 in expected value. Could I beat Bob for 20 big blinds per 100? In other words, is Bob's strategy beatable for 20 big blinds per 100? I'll take a few seconds here, give you time to pause. Absolutely. It could absolutely be beatable for 20 big blinds or more. For example, he could opt for every neutral EV river bluff while missing every neutral EV value bet, which leaves him way over bluffing, leaving him exploitable to you just folding all of your bluff catchers on the river. Another way is that you could look at flop slow plays. So let's say, for example, that he checks every neutral EV slow play where he could bet or check, and then bets every neutral EV bluff where he could bet or check a bluffing hand. Or the reverse of that, where he's betting all potential slow plays, so fast playing too many hands, and then skipping bluffs. Now, in that example, there are a lot of things that are actually going to happen because it compounds over multiple streets. So first of all, his flop c-bet range is going to be too strong, meaning you should overfold flop. Second of all, when he checks back, now you can bet more often and check raise more often because his check back range is going to be too weak. So he'll either overfold to turn probes or he'll call a range that is too weak. And when you check raise, you can go thinner for value because you're not going to run into the slow plays that you would against the solver. And the other way that, there are lots of ways that this could happen, but another type of example is, with specific hand categories. So I previously talked about, queen jack plus air or queen jack in general on that king 10-3 board. The same is true of nut flush draws. There are a lot of nut flush draws that are similar EV betting and checking on the flop. But if you end up betting all of them, now your check back range doesn't turn the nuts on the spade, for example. So you'll have range imbalances on certain cards where your opponent, me, if I'm astute and paying attention, can attack or can overfold, whatever the case may be. These things do add up and they do compound over multiple streets. As I mentioned, your early street range construction affects your river ranges across all lines. And so I can take advantage of it not only on the flop, but on the turn and river as well. And keep in mind, I'm talking about hands that are the same EV, betting and checking. These are things that a solver will say is not a mistake, yet they're clearly huge mistakes that can be taken advantage of. Obviously, if you're now making, a 0.2 big blind mistake in a given hand and a 0.3 big blind mistake in another hand, the EV can be a lot worse against an astute opponent. The gap in your game could be much wider because, of course, there are only so many hands that are very close to neutral EV in two lines. If you kind of widen that gap of allowable mistakes to include hands that are, supposed to be a bet, but you're not losing that much by checking, and then you check those, now you could have your ranges way out of whack. And range construction works in reverse too. A lot of players will relentlessly study flop c-bet spots or pre-flop opens versus pre-flop 3-bet, which, by the way, you should study those things. But some players will get them so perfectly right or close to perfect, yet on the, turns and river runouts, of which there are hundreds of thousands of, depending on, how you categorize them. If you count the 7 of clubs and 7 of spades as the same card. Anyways, they'll inevitably mess something up because it's just too hard. And if all they're learning is memorization, they don't have the tools to adapt to those turns and to those rivers, and they'll just screw up. And then this perfect unexploitable flop c-bet with mid pair and future straight blockers that they then neglect to bluff on the right turns or rivers with their boat blocker and their straight blockers has now become a minus EV flop bet, even though it was perfect and unexploitable. And this is why I say the goal is not to play like a solver. It's to think like a solver. If you can't reason your way through a hand properly, you're inevitably going to make some huge blunders on later streets, which are going to make your kind of perfect range construction on early streets pointless. And actually, in some cases, a mistake. In some cases, you might be better off playing a very suboptimal flop strategy, knowing that you're going to miss bluffs on this turn or on this river, or miss value bets for that matter. Range construction and strategy are interconnected across all decision points. The solver thinks forward and it thinks backwards too. If you mess up any one node of the game tree, it can all fall apart. This might sound discouraging to you, that optimal strategy is so complex that you can't possibly get it close to right. I believe this is great news, not just for poker as a whole, but for you as someone who is learning from this course and is going to take your game seriously. I remember that I feared when solvers came out. I wasn't studying with solvers very much. First of all, they came out in No Limit by the time I was playing PLO only. And then over time, they came out in PLO, but I was so busy running a business that I just didn't pay attention to them. I just kept playing without them. And I kind of feared that poker would become a game of memorization. And the parts that I found so interesting and frankly, the parts that I was better at, making reads, hand reading, adjusting to opponents, would become near obsolete. So I found it incredibly exciting as I progressed, through my study of solvers at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020. I found it incredibly exciting that I was wrong about that the best players make tons of mistakes. The best players are massively exploitable for a huge win rate. Obviously, none of us are max exploiting any of our opponents because that's really hard to do too. But there's so much room to gain a very big edge. And complex poker games against humans will always be beatable for very large edges. I love that, and I hope you're excited about it too. So to sum up, your job is not to become unexploitable. Your job is not to play close to perfect poker. Your job is to minimize your exploitability, both with a simplified game plan and the ability to think logically through a hand in any spot that you find yourself in. It's to move as much as you can from system 2 into system 1 so that your mind is free to make high-level decisions. And then it's just to figure out exactly where and how and when to pick your opponents apart and just really push that EV edge as much as you can. So I keep saying, think like a solver. How does a solver think? The truth is a solver doesn't think. It just runs sim after sim against itself, slightly improving its EV each time and kind of brute forces its way to an optimal strategy. We can't do that as humans. So the best we can do is try to interpret with our little human minds why the solver is doing what it's doing. So I've boiled down kind of the core concepts that I think a solver cares about, based on my interpretation of solver strategy. And that's what we're going to cover in our next few videos. The first is equity and value, which again, I'll explain in the very next video. The second is range construction, which I've talked about the importance of already, but we'll dive into that in more depth. And the third is exploitability and incentives. By that, I mean, well, exploitability is kind of obvious. If I do this, what can my opponent do? And actually, what does it incentivize my opponent to do? They're kind of the same thing. I'm excited to get into it and then move on to the hand examples and all the spot specific videos and eventually to the hand reading, which I'm most excited about. I will see you in the next video.